suspicion. On the primary monitor, Saad Adeyemi, the woman he had brought into his home to care for his mother 6 weeks ago, was moving like a ghost through the darkened corridors of the West Wing. In the high-contrast infrared light, her movements were fluid, hauntingly silent. Min Jae had built a billion-dollar empire on the philosophy that everyone has a price and no one is truly innocent. He had suspected her from the moment she stepped off the plane. The whispered warnings from his paranoid associates, the missing heirloom jewelry, and her late-night ventures into the garden. It all formed a pattern he knew too well. He was convinced she was a plant, a desperate woman using a sick old lady to find a chink in his armor. Min Jae leaned closer, the blue light of the screens reflecting off his cold, calculating gaze. This was the moment of truth. He watched her hand reach for the heavy door to Madame Sio's private suite, her fingers clutching a small object wrapped tightly in a dark cloth. His thumb hovered over the red intercom button that would alert his security detail. With one press, Saad Adeyemi would be neutralized, erased from Seoul as if she had never existed. He wasn't a man who enjoyed cruelty, but he was a man who protected his own. But as her hand turned the handle, a different camera, one Saad didn't know existed, flickered to life inside the bedroom. There was Madame Seo Yun-ok, 76 years old and trapped in the terrifying fog of a night terror. She was standing in the center of the room, her fragile frame shaking as she cried out in a language only the heart understands, lost in a memory of a son she no longer recognized. The air at Incheon International Airport felt like a physical weight against Saad Adeyemi's chest, heavy with the scent of jet fuel and the terrifying reality of her situation. She clutched the handle of her worn suitcase, her palms damp. In her purse sat a contract that felt more like a bill of sale than an employment agreement. The terms were staggering. $15,000 a month to care for a single elderly woman. It was enough to pay for her father's experimental treatments back in Lagos, to buy him the breath the hospital was currently charging for by the minute. But Saad knew that money like this never came without a shadow. A man in a slate-gray suit, eyes hidden behind obsidian lenses, didn't offer a greeting. He simply gestured toward a black Mercedes with windows so dark they looked like polished ink. As they drove toward the outskirts of Seoul, the vibrant city lights gave way to high stone walls topped with an intimidating array of sensors and glass shards that caught the moonlight. The gates opened with a heavy, hydraulic groan, a sound that reminded Saad of a vault ceiling shut. This wasn't a home, it was a fortress. Inside, the mansion was a chilling blend of traditional Korean elegance and cold, industrial security. Every corner housed a blinking lens, a silent witness to every breath she took. Saad was led into a vast, minimalist study where the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Standing by a floor-to-ceiling window was Yoo Min-jae. He was younger than she expected, perhaps mid-30s, but he carried the gravity of a man who had seen too much blood and held too much power. He didn't turn around immediately, leaving her to wither in the silence. "The rules are simple, Miss Adeyemi," he finally said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that carried the edge of a blade. He turned, and Saad felt the air leave her lungs. His eyes were dark, devoid of warmth, and scanned her with the clinical precision of a predator. "My mother is the only thing in this world that matters to me. You are here to be her hands, her feet, and her memory. You will speak to no one outside these walls. You will ask no questions about the men you see or the calls I take. Do you understand?" "I am a nurse, Mr. Yu," Saad replied, her voice trembling but her gaze steady. "My priority is always the patient." "Your priority is my satisfaction," he corrected coldly. He stepped closer, the scent of expensive sandalwood and something metallic clinging to him. "If you fail her, you won't just lose the money. You will lose the ability to ever work again. Anywhere." He led her to the West Wing, where the atmosphere shifted from steel to silk. In a room bathed in the soft glow of paper lanterns sat Madame Seo Yun-ok. She looked like a porcelain doll left in the sun too long, fragile, translucent, and deeply beautiful. When she looked up, her eyes flickered with a brief, sharp lucidity. She looked at her son, then at Saad, and a small, knowing smile touched her lips. In that moment, Saad realized she hadn't just signed a contract for money. She had stepped into a cage where the only key was held by a woman who was slowly forgetting her own name. The first week in the mansion felt like living inside a high-security clock, every second measured by the silent hum of the surveillance cameras that followed Saad from the kitchen to the clinic-grade suite. Madame Seo was a quiet patient, drifting through the hours in a state of soft detachment. But as the sun dipped behind the Seoul skyline on the 5th day, the sundowning began. The fragile woman began to pace the length of the silk rugs, her fingers plucking at the air as if trying to catch threads of a disappearing life. She wasn't calling for medicine or water. She was calling for a version of her son that seemed to have died years ago. Saad watched from the doorway as Madame Seo stood before a portrait of Min Jae, her eyes filled with a grief so sharp it looked like a physical wound. When Min Jae made his nightly 5-minute appearance, stiff, formal, and checking his watch, the old woman would reach out, but he would lean away, his face a mask of granite. He spoke to Saad about vitals and dosages, but he never spoke to his mother about the weather, the garden, or the boy she clearly missed. He thinks strength is a wall, Madame Seo whispered to Saad after Min Jae had exited with a clinical nod. But walls only keep the light out. My son has built a cage for himself, and he doesn't realize I am trapped in here with him. Saad realized then that her job as a nurse was only half of what was required. The clinical routine was keeping Madame Seo alive, but the loneliness was killing her. Saad decided to go off-script. Ignoring the strict dietary guidelines that favored bland, efficient nutrition, Saad spent the afternoon in the kitchen. She bypassed the regular staff and used her own limited supply of Nigerian spices, blending them with traditional Korean ingredients to create a rich, aromatic broth that smelled of home and warmth. When she brought the tray into the room, she didn't just place it on the table. She sat on the floor, making herself smaller, a technique she'd used with hundreds of memory loss patients to build trust. She didn't talk about medication. She talked about the giant oak tree in her father's yard in Lagos and how the air smelled before a tropical rain. Madame Seo's eyes cleared, the fog lifting as she took a sip of the fusion broth. A single tear tracked through the wrinkles on her cheek. I remember the rain, the old woman murmured, her voice stronger than it had been all week. Min Jae used to jump in the puddles until his shoes were ruined. I haven't seen him splash in the rain for 20 years. Saad reached out and took the woman's hand, a gesture strictly forbidden by the professional boundaries Min Jae had outlined in the study. But as Madame Seo gripped her fingers with surprising strength, Saad knew she couldn't go back to being just a maid. She began to sing a soft Yoruba lullaby, the melody weaving through the sterile room like a vine of light. High above, in the darkened security room, Min Jae watched the monitor, his jaw tightening as he saw Saad break every rule he had set. He saw the tear on his mother's face, and for the first time, he didn't know if he should summon security or keep watching. The following morning, Saad bypassed the mansion's state-of-the-art pantry, opting instead for a small bag of ingredients she had sourced from a local market during her only hour of leave. She knew the regular kitchen staff watched her with a mixture of confusion and disdain as she ground Nigerian crayfish into a fine powder and toasted dried seaweed over an open flame. She was chasing a ghost of a flavor, a specific, briny depth that Madame Seo had once described as the taste of a welcoming home. In the sterile, stainless steel kitchen, Saad prepared a fusion of Korean mayakguk and West African flavors, adding the ground crayfish and a drop of palm oil to the traditional seaweed soup. She wasn't just cooking. She was conducting an experiment in sensory archaeology. She knew the cameras were tracking her every measurement, and she knew Min Jae would see the unfamiliar powders as potential toxins. But the risk was the only way to reach the woman fading in the West Wing. When Saad entered the suite, Madame Seo was staring vacantly at the manicured gardens. Saad placed the tray down and gently fanned the steam toward the older woman. The aroma, earthy, salty, and sharp, filled the room. Madame Seo's nostrils flared. Slowly, her head turned, and for the first time in days, her eyes didn't just look. They saw. She took a spoonful, her hand trembling. As the broth hit her tongue, Madame Seo's entire posture changed. She didn't just sit. She sat up. This is the soup from the island, she whispered, her voice thick with sudden, piercing clarity. My mother-in-law. She used a secret dried fish from the coast. No one has been able to find that taste for 40 years. Tears pooled in the creases of her eyes, but they weren't the tears of a confused patient. They were the tears of a woman who had just found a lost key. I remember the day Min-jae was born, she said, looking directly at Saad. It was raining, and the house smelled exactly like this. He was so small, and I promised him the world would never make him cold. She grabbed Saada's hand, her grip surprisingly fierce. How did you find this? How did you know my heart was starving? 3 floors up, Min-jae stood frozen in front of the wall of monitors. He watched his mother, a woman he had written off as a shell, speaking with a lucidity that defied every medical report on his desk. He saw her crying, saw her gripping the hand of the maid he had intended to fire, and saw her eat with an appetite she hadn't possessed in years. But where his mother saw a miracle, Min-jae's hardened mind saw a threat. How could a stranger from half a world away unlock a memory he couldn't reach? He zoomed in on the bowl of soup, his eyes narrowing at the reddish tint of the palm oil. In his world, a person who could manipulate the mind through the senses was the most dangerous kind of operative. His heart hammered against his ribs, half in shock at his mother's joy, and half in a cold, rising panic that Saad Adeyemi was far more than a simple nurse. He reached for the phone to call his head of security. The atmosphere in the mansion's command center was thick with a new, sharper tension. Min-jae's second-in-command, a man whose loyalty was as cold as the steel he carried, stood at the edge of the mahogany desk, his shadow stretching long across the floor. The associates are talking, sir, he whispered, his eyes fixed on the footage of Saad reading to Madame Seo. They see the change in your mother. They see a foreign girl who has suddenly become the most influential person in this wing. In our world, that is a vulnerability they will look to exploit. Min-jae's jaw tightened. He looked at the screen, seeing not the kindness in Saada's eyes, but the potential for a catastrophic security breach. His inner circle had begun to murmur that Saad was too lucky, that her ability to soothe the matriarch was a calculated move by a rival syndicate to plant an asset deep within the Kim household. Desperation, they argued, made people capable of the most intricate deceptions. She's a caregiver, Min-jae argued, though his voice lacked its usual absolute conviction. She is a woman whose father is dying and whose bank account is empty, the subordinate countered. That makes her a weapon if the right hand wields her. We need to know what she does when she thinks the house is asleep. Under the weight of his own guilt and the mounting pressure of his organization, Min-jae made the decision that felt like a betrayal of the peace Saad had brought to the West Wing. Do it, he commanded. I want full surveillance. Every corner, every whisper. I want to see her when she's alone. That night, while Saad slept a heavy, exhausted sleep in the room adjacent to Madame Seo, a team of silent technicians moved through the hallways like smoke. They were ghosts in the dark, installing pinhole cameras behind the intricate wood carvings of the bed frame, inside the air vents, and behind the eyes of the decorative traditional masks that hung on the walls. Microphones so sensitive they could pick up the frantic beating of a heart were embedded into the very foundation of her private space. By 4 a.m., Min-jae sat alone in the darkness, the glow of a dozen new monitors reflecting in his cold eyes. He had authorized the ultimate invasion, a 24/7 voyeuristic window into Saad Adeyemi's life. He told himself it was for the safety of the empire, for the protection of his mother's fragile life. But as he watched the grainy, black and white feet of Saad shifting in her sleep, her face appearing younger and more vulnerable than it did in the daylight, a flicker of shame stirred beneath his ironclad exterior. He had turned his home into a laboratory and the only person who cared for his mother into a specimen. He gave himself a deadline, 72 hours. If Saad was a spy, she would slip up. If she was innocent, he would have to find a way to live with the monster he saw in his own reflection. The first day of total surveillance yielded nothing but the mundane rhythms of devotion. Min-jae sat in the flickering shadows of his office, watching Saad through the pinhole lenses as she practiced Korean honorifics at dawn and meticulously charted Madame Seo's fluid intake. He looked for a hand passing a note, a lingering glance at a keypad, or the frantic typing of a coded message. Instead, he saw a woman who seemed to exist only to serve a mother who wasn't her own. It was during the quiet lull of the afternoon, while Madame Co napped under the warmth of a silk quilt, that the suspicious behavior finally began. Min-jae leaned forward, his pulse quickening as Saad retreated to her small, secondary bedroom and locked the door. She pulled a cheap, cracked smartphone from her pocket and dialed a number with an international prefix. The audio feed crackled to life, sensitive enough to capture the jagged breath Saad took before the call connected. On the screen, a video feed flickered to life. An elderly man appeared, his dark skin ashen and his chest heaving under the strain of an oxygen mask. The background was a cramped, dimly lit room in Lagos, the sounds of a struggling city filtering through a nearby window. "Papa?" Saad whispered, her voice losing its professional iron and dissolving into a soft, melodic grief. The man on the screen tried to smile, but it turned into a racking cough that made Saad flinch as if she'd been struck. "My sunshine," he rasped in a voice thin as paper. "You should be enjoying the world, not sending every kobo back here. The doctors, they say it is too much. You have done enough, Saad." "I haven't done anything yet," she sobbed, her face crumbling in the privacy of her prison. "The director of the clinic said if I can pay the next installment by the end of the month, they will start the new trial. I'm almost there, Papa. Just stay with me. Please, just fight a little longer." She spoke of her kind employer and the beautiful mansion, painting a picture of a fairy tale to mask the cold, surveillance-choked reality she actually inhabited. She lied with a grace that was heartbreaking, telling him she was happy so he wouldn't feel the weight of her sacrifice. In the command center, Min-jae felt the air in the room grow thin. He watched Saad press her forehead against the phone screen, closing her eyes as if she could feel her father's warmth through the digital divide. He looked at his own hands, the hands that had signed the orders for the cameras, the hands that had built an empire on the back of his own father's cold legacy. For years, Min-jae had told himself that his ruthlessness was a tribute to his father's last words, "Protect her." He had sacrificed his humanity to safeguard his mother's body. Yet here was a woman sacrificing her very soul to save her father's life. He wasn't watching a spy, he was watching a mirror. They were both children of dying parents, bound by a blood money contract that demanded everything and gave nothing back but survival. As Saad hung up and buried her face in her pillow to muffle her sobs, the Ice King of Seoul found his vision blurring, the monitors reflecting a man who was starting to hate the person he had become. The digital clock in the security suite ticked over to 3 a.m., the numbers glowing like a warning in the dark room where Min-jae sat, motionless. His heart hammered against his ribs as he watched the monitor, his finger hovering over the intercom button that could end Saada's life with a single command. On screen, Saad moved down the hallway toward his mother's bedroom, her silhouette illuminated by the eerie green tint of the night vision cameras. She was holding a small, flat object concealed in a dark cloth, the very poison or theft Min-jae's associates had predicted. He watched, breathless, as she slipped into Madame Co's room. The hidden pinhole cameras inside the suite flickered to life, providing a crystal-clear view of the tragedy unfolding. Madame Co was upright in bed, her eyes wide and glassy, trapped in the visceral terror of a memory that no longer made sense. She was screaming silently, her hands clawing at the air as she called for her long-dead husband. Saad didn't reach for a sedative or a weapon. Instead, she sat on the edge of the bed and carefully unwrapped the cloth. It wasn't a knife or a stolen jewel. It was a handmade book, its pages filled with photographs she had scavenged from the house's archives and decorated with pressed flowers from the garden. Min-jae's breath hitched as he zoomed in. It was a memory book, a chronological map of his mother's life designed to anchor her when the world turned into a storm of confusion. "Look here, Yama," Saad whispered, using the Korean word for mother she had learned in secret. She pointed to a faded picture of a young woman in a hanbok. "This is you on your wedding day. You said the sun was so bright it felt like the heavens were smiling. Do you remember?" Madame Co's frantic breathing began to slow. Her trembling hands reached out to touch the image of her younger self. "The sun," she murmured, the terror in her eyes replaced by a flickering warmth. As the old woman leaned her head against Sada's shoulder, Sad began to sing. Not a Korean song, but that same low, rhythmic African lullaby. It was a bridge of sound, a melody that bypassed language to speak directly to the soul. Sad held the mother of the empire with a tenderness that Min-jae hadn't shown her in a decade. In the command center, the Ice King felt a sudden, hot sting in his eyes. He watched the monitor as Sad wiped a tear from his mother's cheek, then one from her own. He saw that the mysterious object wasn't a tool of betrayal, but a vessel of pure, unconditional love. He realized then that while he had been watching her to prove her guilt, he had inadvertently documented his own failure as a son. The man who ruled through fear found himself sobbing in the dark, shattered by the realization that a stranger was the only one truly protecting the heart of his family. Min-jae sat in the flickering blue light of the surveillance suite, the silence of the room magnifying the sound of his own ragged breathing. On the screens before him, the 72-hour cycle was nearing its end, but the man who had started this watch was gone. He stared at his own reflection in the dark glass of an unlit monitor, the sharp, expensive suit, the cold set of his jaw, and the eyes that had seen everyone as a potential target. For years, he had convinced himself that his hardness was a shield, a necessary sacrifice to maintain the empire his father had left in his trembling hands. He replayed the footage of Sad holding his mother in the dead of night, her voice a soft anchor in a sea of dementia. He looked at the meticulous charts Sad had kept, the pages of notes on Madame Sio's favorite flowers, the way her breathing changed when she was anxious, and the specific melodies that brought her back to the shore of lucidity. It was a record of devotion that no amount of money could buy, yet he had met that devotion with hidden lenses and pinhole microphones. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't the hero protecting his mother from a predator. He was the monster who had turned her final sanctuary into a laboratory. He had watched Sad weep for her own father, seen her struggle with a grief identical to his own, and yet he had continued to track her like a criminal. He saw now that while Sad had been building a bridge to his mother's heart, he had been busy reinforcing the walls of her gilded cage. "What have I become?" he whispered to the empty room, his voice cracking. He remembered his mother's words from the surveillance feed, her voice clear and cutting even through the digital static. "He's forgotten how to love. He thinks strength means being cold." She hadn't been talking to a stranger. She had been talking to him, knowing he was watching, pleading with the ghost of the son he used to be. He looked at the button that would summon his security team, the tool he had intended to use to erase Sad from their lives. His hand trembled, not with the adrenaline of a hunt, but with the weight of a profound and sudden shame. He had spent his life reading people, looking for the lie in every smile, yet he had been blind to the most obvious truth in his own home. The armor he had worn for a decade didn't just protect him, it had fossilized him. As he reached out to shut down the feed, he didn't see a maid on the screen anymore. He saw a woman who was more of a daughter to his mother than he was a son, and he realized that if he didn't change, he would be the one who was truly erased. The shadows in the mansion's sprawling gardens were usually a source of peace for Sad, the only place where she could breathe without the weight of the gilded cage pressing against her ribs. At midnight, she knelt in the cool, damp earth of a secluded corner, checking the progress of the Korean mint and mugwort she had planted in secret. She hoped these traditional herbs would bolster Madame Sio's clarity, a quiet rebellion against the inevitable fog of the disease. She was so focused on the fragile sprouts that she didn't hear the soft crunch of gravel or the synchronized movement of men closing in from the perimeter. Inside the command center, Min-jae's blood turned to ice. A red alert flared on his secondary monitor. A perimeter breach. 6 figures, moving with the lethal precision of the Yakuza, had bypassed the outer sensors and were converging on the garden. They didn't want the vault. They wanted the vulnerability. They wanted Sad. For 72 hours, Min-jae had lived his life through a glass screen, a passive observer of the grace he had lacked. But as he watched a gloved hand reach for Sada's shoulder, the Ice King finally shattered. He didn't reach for the intercom to delegate the violence. He tore his tailored jacket off, grabbed the heavy service pistol from his desk safe, and sprinted toward the west exit. Saad gasped as a rough hand clamped over her mouth, the scent of industrial grease and tobacco overwhelming her. She struggled, her heels kicking uselessly against the dirt, as she was dragged toward the darkness of the tree line. Then, the night was split by the roar of a gunshot and the blinding flash of the mansion's floodlights. Min-jae appeared at the top of the stone stairs, his silhouette framed by the light, looking less like a businessman and more like the storm he had been repressing for years. He moved with a ferocity that stunned even the Yakuza operatives. "Let her go," he commanded, his voice a low, terrifying vibration that carried the weight of a death sentence. A blade flashed in the moonlight near Sada's throat, but Min-jae didn't hesitate. He stepped into the line of fire, his presence drawing the attacker's focus away from the terrified woman in the dirt. In the chaos that followed, the shouts, the clash of steel, and the rapid response of his own security team, Min-jae never took his eyes off Saad. When the threat was finally neutralized and the intruders were being dragged away into the shadows, Min-jae dropped his weapon and knelt beside her. Saad was shaking, her dress stained with the earth of the garden she had tried to heal. He didn't offer a professional hand to help her up. He pulled her into a fierce, protective embrace, his heart hammering against hers. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her hair, the words raw and jagged. "I let you walk into this. I was watching, but I wasn't seeing." Saad pulled back, her eyes wide with shock and the first stirrings of a new kind of fear. "You were watching?" The armor was gone. Min-jae looked at the woman who had saved his mother's soul, and realized that the screens could no longer protect him from the truth. The Yakuza had tried to take his weakness, but they had only succeeded in forcing him to find his strength. The silence following the garden skirmish was heavier than the violence itself. Min-jae stood in his office, no longer behind the monitors, but facing Saad directly. The room was stripped of its clinical distance. The hidden cameras in the West Wing had been deactivated, their glass eyes dark and sightless. Saad stood by the window, her silhouette a study in weary resilience, looking out at the fortress that had almost become her tomb. "You should leave," Min-jae said, his voice stripped of its usual iron authority. "I will pay the full amount for your father's treatment tonight. I will provide a year's salary as severance and a private detail to escort you safely back to Atlanta. You have done more for this family than I deserved." Saad turned, her eyes searching his face for the Ice King she had first met. She found only a man whose armor had been systematically dismantled by the sight of a handmade memory book and the sound of an African lullaby. "And what happens to Madame Seo?" she asked softly. "What happens to the woman who finally remembered the smell of the rain?" Min-jae looked away, his jaw tightening. "The Yakuza do not forget. Because you cared for her, because you reached me, you are now a permanent target. If you stay as a caregiver, there will always be a breach, always another shadow in the garden." He took a breath, the words feeling foreign and heavy. "In my world, there is only one way to make someone truly untouchable. There is a blood oath that transcends business, a line that even my enemies will not cross." He stepped into the light, meeting her gaze with a vulnerability that would have been a death sentence in the underworld. "If you were a Kim, not an employee but family, you would be protected by laws older than this organization. I am proposing a marriage of protection." Saad stared at him, the absurdity of the moment clashing with the life-or-death reality of the night. "You want me to marry a man who spied on my most private grief? I want to give you a shield," Min-jae countered, his voice desperate. "No expectations. Separate lives, if that is what you wish. But you would have the name, the resources to ensure your father never wants for anything again, and the right to stay with the woman who calls you her daughter." He paused, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "And perhaps you could continue teaching me how to be a son. I don't know how to be the man my mother remembers, but I want to learn." Saad looked at the man who had traded his surveillance for a promise. She thought of Madame Seo's laughter and her father's gasping breath. She saw the remorse in Min-jae's eyes, a man capable of change, standing in the wreckage of his own rigid world. "I have conditions," she said, her voice reclaiming its strength. "No more cameras. Real time with your mother. And you start living as a man, not a machine." Min-jae bowed his head, a gesture of absolute surrender. "I promise." As the sun began to rise over the stone walls, the gilded cage finally opened. It wasn't a fairy tale, but it was a beginning. Saad Adeyemi was no longer a maid in a mafia house. She was the untouchable heart of a new empire, and Yu Min-jae was finally finding his way back to being human.